If you are over 60 years old, I want you to stop whatever you're doing for the next 25 minutes, because there are 7 things that the vast majority of people your age are still doing, every single day, without realizing it's quietly working against them. And number 4 on this list, the one almost nobody questions, is something I'd be willing to bet most of you watching this right now did sometime in just the last 24 hours, probably this very morning if I had to guess. By the time we finish going through all 7, you are going to look at your own daily routine completely differently, and more importantly, you are going to know exactly what to do instead. Starting today, not next month, not after the holidays, today, while it's fresh in your mind and you actually feel motivated to make a small change. I'm Dr. Hale Thorne. I've practiced medicine for more than 30 years, and somewhere around year 15 or so, I started noticing the same handful of habits showing up over and over again in my patients who were struggling. The same small daily decisions, repeated thousands of times over the years, quietly adding up into much bigger problems than any single decision could ever cause on its own. None of these 7 things are dramatic. None of them are the kind of thing that lands you in an emergency room overnight. They're slower than that, sneakier than that, which honestly makes them more dangerous in some ways, not less, because there's never one single moment that forces you to pay attention. And before you think I'm standing up here lecturing from some perfect place, let me just say, I caught myself doing at least 3 of these 7 myself, more recently than I'd like to admit. So consider this me talking to myself just as much as I'm talking to you, 2 people on the same side of this trying to figure it out together. Before we get started, I want you to do something for me. Down in the comments, tell me your age, and tell me honestly how many of these 7 you think you're guilty of before I even get into the list. I read every comment that comes in on these videos, and it genuinely shapes what I bring up in future ones, so don't hold back on me. All right, let's get into it, starting at number 7 and working our way down to the one I consider the most important by far. Number 7 is sitting for more than 2 hours at a stretch without standing up, whether that's in front of the television, at the kitchen table after a meal, or in a favorite chair doing a crossword or reading the paper. Here's what's happening during those long stretches that most people never think about. Your circulation slows dramatically the longer you stay in one position. Blood pools in your lower legs, and the muscles that normally help pump that blood back up toward your heart simply go quiet. Researchers have found that long, uninterrupted sitting is associated with measurably higher risks for cardiovascular issues, completely independent of how much exercise a person does at other points in their day. That part surprises people every time I explain it, because so many of my patients tell me, "But doctor, I walk every morning, I do my exercises, and that's wonderful," genuinely. But if you walk for 30 minutes and then sit for the remaining 15 hours of your waking day, the sitting still matters enormously on its own, almost as if the body keeps 2 separate ledgers, one for movement and one for stillness. And it doesn't simply let one cancel out the other. I had a patient, a retired accountant, who took tremendous pride in his daily walk, 3 miles every single morning without fail, rain or shine, who couldn't understand why his circulation numbers weren't improving the way he expected, despite being more disciplined about his morning walk than most men half his age. It turned out he spent almost the entire rest of his day in a recliner working on puzzles, sometimes 4 or 5 hours without getting up even once except for meals. And once we simply added standing breaks every hour, nothing dramatic, just 2 or 3 minutes up and moving around the house, refilling a glass of water, checking the mail, even just standing at the window for a moment, his numbers shifted noticeably within about 2 months. He told me afterward that the change felt almost too small to have made a real difference, which is exactly why so many people never bother trying it in the first place. And that's really the whole problem with this particular habit. None of the individual minutes feel significant. It's only the accumulated hours, day after day, year after year, that eventually show up on a chart in front of you. Number 6 is skipping protein at breakfast, something that seems harmless on the surface, a piece of toast, maybe some juice, coffee of course, and out the door or off to whatever the morning holds. But after 60, your body becomes considerably less efficient at building and maintaining muscle, a condition we call sarcopenia when it becomes significant. And protein, especially earlier in the day, is one of the simplest tools we have to fight against that natural decline. Starting the day with mostly carbohydrates and little to no protein means your body has nothing to work with for hours, and over months and years, that adds up to real, measurable strength loss. The kind that eventually affects something as simple as opening a jar, or carrying laundry up a flight of stairs, or lifting a grandchild up into your arms the way you used to without thinking twice about it. I always tell my patients, even something as simple as adding a couple of eggs, or a serving of plain yogurt, or even leftover chicken from the night before, makes a measurable difference over time, far more than people expect from such a small daily change. One of my patients, a woman who'd never been much of a breakfast eater her whole life, just black coffee most mornings out of habit going back decades, started keeping hard-boiled eggs in the refrigerator simply because I suggested it might be worth trying. Within a few months of blood work and a simple grip strength test we do in the office, the difference was clear enough that even she was surprised, and she told me she felt steadier carrying groceries in from the car, which is exactly the kind of everyday change that matters most. Number 5 is consistently going to bed and waking up at wildly different times from one day to the next, what we call irregular sleep timing. A lot of people assume that as long as they're getting their 7 or 8 hours total, the timing doesn't matter much. But your body runs on an internal clock that governs far more than just when you feel sleepy. It influences digestion, blood pressure regulation, hormone release, even how your immune system behaves overnight while you're not even aware of any of it happening. When that internal clock gets confused by inconsistent timing, going to bed at 9 one night and midnight the next, sleeping in until 10 on weekends after rising at 6 all week, the quality of sleep itself suffers, even if the total hours look fine on paper. Almost like a band that's technically playing all the right notes but never quite in time with each other. I had a patient who insisted her sleep was perfectly fine because she always got her 8 hours. And on paper, she genuinely did. But once we looked closely at her actual schedule, week by week, those 8 hours were happening at a completely different time every single night, sometimes starting as early as 9:30. Other nights not until well past midnight, depending on what was on television or how the day had gone. We worked on simply anchoring her wake-up time, same time every single morning regardless of when she fell asleep the night before, which is a small thing that sounds almost too simple to matter. And within about 3 weeks, she told me she felt more rested than she had in years, without changing the total number of hours even slightly, simply by giving her internal clock something steady to hold on to. Number 4, and this is the one I genuinely believe most people watching this have done within the past day, is drinking your coffee, or any caffeinated beverage, within the first hour of waking up, before your body has had a chance to naturally clear out its own cortisol surge. Cortisol naturally peaks shortly after you wake up. It's part of what gets you alert and moving in the first place, your body's own built-in alarm clock essentially. And when you layer caffeine directly on top of that natural peak, you're essentially asking your body to handle 2 stimulants at once, which for a lot of people after 60 translates into that jittery, slightly anxious feeling some people describe after their morning cup, or that energy crash that hits hard around 10 or 11 in the morning, right when you actually need to be sharp for the rest of the day ahead of you. I'm not telling you to give up your coffee. I'd never survive making that recommendation to half my patients, myself included some mornings. Coffee is one of life's small, genuine pleasures, and I'm not in the business of taking those away unnecessarily. What I am suggesting is waiting just 60 to 90 minutes after waking before that first cup, giving your body's natural cortisol rhythm room to do its job first, brushing your teeth, getting dressed, maybe reading the morning paper or checking in with the family before that first sip. Patients who've tried this small shift consistently tell me their energy throughout the entire morning feels noticeably steadier, less of a spike followed by a crash, more of a gentle, sustained lift that actually lasts through to lunchtime instead of abandoning them halfway through the morning. One of my patients, a retired nurse herself who frankly knew more about the body than most people I see, told me she was skeptical this would make any real difference. She'd been having coffee the moment she opened her eyes for over 40 years. She tried it for 2 weeks purely to prove me wrong, she joked, and came back admitting that the mid-morning crash she'd simply accepted as normal for decades had genuinely disappeared. Number 3 is eating your largest meal of the day at dinner, often quite late in the evening, which has become almost the default pattern in this country. A light breakfast, a modest lunch, and then a substantial dinner sometime after 6 or 7, often the one meal of the day the whole family actually sits down together for. Your body's ability to process a large meal efficiently, particularly the carbohydrates and sugars within it, naturally declines as the day goes on, meaning that same plate of food sits differently in your system at 8 in the evening than it would have at noon. Your body simply isn't prepared to handle it the same way once the sun has gone down. This isn't about which foods you eat. It's purely about timing, and shifting even a portion of that evening meal earlier in the day, or simply making lunch the larger meal instead of dinner, can make a measurable difference in how you sleep that night and how you feel the following morning, often within just a couple of weeks of making the switch. I think of one couple I treated, married over 50 years, who'd always eaten dinner together around 8 in the evening out of pure habit. simply because that's when they'd always done it, going back to when they both worked full time, and that was simply when everyone got home. Neither of them slept particularly well. Both assumed it was simply part of getting older, the way so many people quietly assume restless nights are just the price of admission for being past 60. We shifted their dinner to 6, nothing else changed. Same foods, same portions, just 2 hours earlier. And within roughly a month, both of them reported falling asleep faster and waking up less during the night. And the husband joked at his next visit that he hadn't realized 2 hours could matter that much until he actually tried it, after 50 years of doing it the other way without ever once questioning it. Number 2 is avoiding using your hands for detailed, fiddly tasks, because they've become a little more frustrating than they used to be. Things like sewing, working on small craft projects, even typing on a phone with smaller buttons, or fiddling with a fishing knot the way you always used to without a second thought. What happens here is a discouraging cycle. The task feels harder than it used to, so people quietly stop doing it, telling themselves they'll get back to it eventually. And the less you use those fine motor pathways in your hands and brain, the more those pathways genuinely weaken from disuse, making the next attempt feel even more frustrating, which leads to avoiding it even more. A slow, downward spiral that has very little to do with actual physical decline and a great deal to do with simply giving up the practice. I encourage my patients to keep doing these things specifically because they're frustrating. Not despite it, the frustration itself is a sign the brain and hands are working hard to maintain that connection, and stepping away entirely accelerates the very decline people are trying to avoid in the first place. I had a patient who used to do beautiful needlework, decades of it, beautiful pillowcases and table runners she'd made for every grandchild's wedding, who quietly put it away in a drawer after her hands started shaking just enough to frustrate her. It sat untouched for nearly 2 years. When she finally picked it back up, slower than before, admittedly, the shaking that had scared her off in the first place actually improved with regular practice, not because the needlework cured anything medically, but because the steady, repetitive use of those small muscles and that hand-eye coordination kept the entire system working the way it's designed to. Number 2.5, if I can sneak in a bonus point here because it's so closely connected to the last one, is letting your reading habit fade away in favor of simply watching more television passively. Reading, even just a chapter of a novel or the morning paper cover to cover, asks your brain to actively construct images, follow complex sentences, and hold information across paragraphs, a kind of mental exercise that passive television watching simply doesn't require in the same way. Patients who maintain a regular reading habit well into their 70s and 80s consistently score better on the simple cognitive screenings we do in the office than those who've quietly let reading fall away in favor of having the television on most of the day. And number 1, the habit I genuinely consider more damaging over time than any of the other 6 combined, is isolating yourself socially, even in small, seemingly reasonable ways, skipping the weekly card game because you're a little tired, declining the family gathering because the drive feels like too much effort lately, letting phone calls with old friends become shorter and less frequent over the years without ever consciously deciding to pull back. Loneliness and chronic social isolation are associated with health outcomes after 60 that rival smoking and physical inactivity in terms of their measurable impact on the body, on inflammation levels, on cognitive decline, on the immune system's ability to function properly. And frankly, the research on this has only gotten more convincing the longer it's been studied, to the point where some researchers now describe chronic loneliness almost as its own independent risk factor, separate from anything else going on in a person's health. And here's what makes this one so dangerous. It never announces itself the way physical decline does. There's no moment where you suddenly notice you're isolated. It simply happens one small, skipped gathering at a time, one shortened phone call at a time, until years later you look up and realize your circle has quietly shrunk down to almost nothing. And by then, it can feel like an enormous effort to rebuild what slipped away so gradually. The way a garden left untended for a single season can suddenly feel impossible to bring back, when really it just needed regular small attention all along, not one massive effort all at once. I think about the men in particular who come into my office, retired, capable, physically reasonably healthy, who've simply stopped reaching out to the people they used to call regularly, not out of any real decision, just gradual drift, often after a spouse passes or a longtime friend moves away, and the change in their entire outlook on life once they reconnect with even one or two of those old relationships is honestly more dramatic than most medications I could ever prescribe them. I had one such patient, a widower who'd quietly stopped attending his old fishing group after his wife passed, telling himself he just wasn't in the mood anymore, for almost 2 years straight. His daughter finally convinced him to go back for one Saturday morning, just one, and he ended up staying for the entire season, every single week after that, and told me at his next appointment that he hadn't realized how much he'd missed simply being around people who knew him until he was sitting in that boat again. I think about that conversation often because nothing in that man's blood work had changed in those 2 years. His cholesterol, his blood pressure, all of it looked roughly the same on paper, and yet by every measure that actually matters to quality of life, he was an entirely different person within a few months of going back. It's worth saying plainly, the relationships you let drift away don't always come back on their own. Somebody usually has to make the first small move, a phone call, a text, showing up uninvited to one gathering just to see how it feels. And more often than people expect, that first small effort is rewarded far more warmly than they brace themselves for. Now, quick pause here, because if you've made it this far in the video, that already tells me something good about how seriously you take your own health, so go ahead and tap that like button. It genuinely helps this reach more people our age who need to hear exactly this. And let me know down in the comments, out of all 7, which one hit closest to home for you, or which one genuinely surprised you. I read every single one of these. So here's where I want to leave you today. None of these 7 things require a complete overhaul of your entire life. And none of them require giving anything up that you genuinely love. They require small, conscious adjustments, standing up once an hour, adding a little protein in the morning, moving dinner earlier, picking that needlework or that crossword back up even when your hands feel clumsier than they used to, reaching out to one old friend this week instead of letting another month slide by. I've watched patients shift 2 or 3 of these in a single month and report feeling noticeably different within just a few weeks. More energy, better sleep, a clearer head, simply from these small course corrections, none of which required a single new prescription or a dramatic lifestyle change of any kind. Before you go, think of someone in your life who might be doing several of these 7 without even realizing it. A sibling, a neighbor, a friend from church, and send them this video. Sometimes the most useful thing we can do for someone we love is simply hand them information they didn't know they were missing, the kind of thing nobody thinks to mention in a normal conversation. But that could genuinely change how the next 10 or 20 years of their life actually feel. And if you're curious about the one specific evening habit I tell nearly all of my patients to add, because it quietly undoes the damage from several of these 7 things at once, that's exactly what I'm covering in the very next video, so make sure you don't miss it. This video is intended for general educational information based on clinical experience and published research, and it is not a substitute for an actual conversation with your own doctor, who knows your specific health history far better than I ever could from all the way over here. Take good care of yourselves out there, and I will see you in the next one.